this video, I'm going to talk about boundaries, what they are, why they're important, why it's difficult for many people to set boundaries, and how to set boundaries, and more. If you're somebody who's struggling with setting boundaries, please stick with me for the entire video. I'm going to say a lot of things. What I'm not going to do is just offer a 3-step process or a trick for setting boundaries. It's a lot more involved than that, and fully understanding it, I think, prepares us in a much more potent way to effectively set boundaries when we need to. Hello, I'm Michael Dewan-Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach with over 40 years of experience. And in my practice, I frequently encounter clients who have issues with boundaries and a difficulty with setting them on people in their lives. It may be a partner who has an alcohol or drug problem. It may be a friend who makes excessive demands for attention and support, who doesn't reciprocate and likes to call the shots around all the social events that you do together. It may be a sibling who repeatedly borrows money and doesn't look for a job or do anything to provide for themselves. It may be parents who demand frequent contact, and yet when you see them, they tend to be critical and toxic. It may be a boss who keeps piling on the work and giving you deadlines with no recognition of how much time it takes, no sense of what you actually can do. Maybe some of these examples sound familiar to you, or you have your own. In any case, if you can relate to it, please stick with me. Let's take a deep dive and get to the bottom of this together. Okay, let's start very simply, and we'll build up from there. First question we can ask is, what is a boundary? It's basically what establishes a separateness between one thing and everything else. It could be a fence around a property. It could be a moat around a castle. It could be a cell wall around a cell. It could be the skin of our body. It establishes a threshold, and it keeps unwanted intrusions from getting in. In a real sense, the entire phenomenal world and everything in it exists because things have boundaries. A flower exists because its petals come to a delicate hand. And we exist because we have boundaries. In a spiritual sense, you may connect with the idea that we're all one and we're connected to the infinite beingness of the universe. Okay, granted. But in the relative world, there's boundaries, and we can only exist in relationship to that infinity by having boundaries. So having acknowledged what boundaries are, basically what allows anything to exist at all, including ourselves, I invite you to take a moment right now, perhaps close your eyes, and just feel your separateness. Feel the boundary of your skin in space. Feel the boundary of your own mind from other people's minds. Just feel that. And affirm to yourself that you have a right to be here in your separateness, as much as anybody else deserves to be here, as much as the moon deserves to be here, or a tree deserves to be here. You deserve to be here. And in being here, there are conditions that are necessary in order to sustain your beingness here. Many will be provided for you, but not everything will be provided for you. You can't set the distance between the sun and the earth, or the rotation of the earth. You can't control the seasons, but there are things that you can control, things that will regulate whether or not the conditions needed for you to survive and thrive are met. And that's where boundaries come in. That's what they're going to be about. But they have to start with, and this will be a theme that I'll carry through this video, is your right to set them, your right to be here, the naturalness of your needs in order to survive and thrive. Those are okay, and we can affirm them. So we'll start with that. Okay, so now let's consider what happens if we don't have sufficient boundaries in our lives. Okay, what happens for a castle that doesn't have a moat or a wall? It's easily overtaken by an approaching army. What happens to a swimming pool that has a leak? the water empties out and you can't swim in it? What happens to a paragraph without punctuation? It's very difficult to understand. What happens to you if you drive a car without a windshield? You get bugs in your eyes and you crash. So basically what happens when we don't have boundaries is that we lose the form of our lives. We lose the shape that provides the container for our well-being. And our functions are compromised and all kinds of things happen to break our system down. Without boundaries, important things leak or bleed out, and toxic things seep or flood in and wreak havoc. We can be reduced to mere survival, and if it goes too far, we won't even be able to survive. We won't even be able to exist. We need to have boundaries. Without them, everything falls apart. So what are the areas of our life where we need to set boundaries? If you've seen any of my other videos, you'll be familiar with these 4 categories that I think provide a framework or a structure to think about this in: the body, the mind, relationships, and environment. So, to start with body, we need physical boundaries. It may be a certain amount of personal space that we require. It may be that we have boundaries about who is going to touch us and how they're going to touch us. We may have boundaries about what kind of activities we're willing to engage in with people. If you're not a good downhill skier and you're afraid and you've broken a leg or something, you might have a boundary about that. You might not want to participate. And maybe especially if you're being invited to a drunken downhill skiing party, you might decline. You might need a boundary. Another physical boundary we can have is not just our body itself, but our possessions, our belongings. We may have a limit to what we'll give away, to what we'll lend out, to what we let people use. This can include money. So it's the boundaries we have around our physical body and everything in our lives that's ours, that's physical. In terms of mind, the most basic limit or boundary we might set is how much of our attention we're willing to give to somebody. Beyond that, it's how much personal information we're willing to share, despite perhaps curiosity and prodding to know. We may not want to share things with people that we don't know that well yet, or particularly with people that we don't trust. We may need to keep our cards close to our chest, so to speak. There may be some subjects or topics that we decide not to talk to some people. Maybe we anticipate inevitable, non-productive arguments and conflict, or we just don't want to get into it. So we can have a boundary about what we talk about, even if it's not personal. We may need to keep a boundary around what we actually think, what our opinion is. Somebody may be trying to persuade us. I'm not saying that we should never allow ourselves to be persuaded, but if we're not persuaded, we can set a boundary and say, I don't agree. Or we can say, let's agree to disagree. So we don't have to let somebody else's opinion intrude on us and cause us to either betray ourselves or pretend that we think something that we don't. Another really important boundary that we need to keep, I think, to maintain our integrity as a separate person is our decisions. That when we've thought something through and we've made a choice about what direction we want to go, what we want to do, that we not let other people try to decide for us or tell us what we should do. This can happen particularly with parents, but there are a lot of people in our lives who may tell us what they think we should do. And our decisions should be our own decisions, and we should stand by them if we're going to hold a boundary and maintain our own integrity. Okay, boundaries in relationships. In a sense, I'm focusing on interpersonal boundaries altogether in this conversation, but I want to focus specifically on relationships. in the sense that we can choose who we let into our life. We can choose who our friends are. We can choose how much time we spend with our friends. We can choose our mate or our partner or our spouse. And we can choose when to end that relationship. If we don't have boundaries, then we feel that we just have to kind of allow whoever shows up into our life, and whoever wants to hold on to us, we feel that we must allow them and we must let them be there. To have boundaries means that we can make choices and we can really fashion our social world according to who brings in nutrients. We consider ourselves like a cell that allows nutrients in, and the cell wall keeps out the toxins. We can do that socially. And I'm not saying that we should reject anybody who's unpleasant or demanding in any way. I am saying that it's important over time to evaluate what a person is bringing into our life and whether that's something good or whether that's something toxic, and be able to draw a line when it's toxic. Okay, next, environmental boundaries. This is basically about choosing where we spend time, where we live, where we work, where we play, and where we choose not to live, work, or play. We may get pressure to be in certain places that we don't want to be in. It may be necessary sometimes to be someplace we don't want, but whenever we have a choice, an option, I'm saying we can have a boundary about it. We can decide not to work in a place that doesn't seem safe and is ill-equipped and has a toxic culture going on. We may not want to rent a flat that's in the wrong location and doesn't have enough light and is shabby. We may not want to go to a leisure place that is not comfortable or interesting or have any amenities. And we can be particular about that and decide. And if it's in relation to somebody else who has needs, they can be negotiated, but we can hold firm and have our own standards. A very simple boundary when it comes to environments is doors, and doors with locks. When we're in our own space, we can close the door. We can put a do not disturb sign on it. We can lock the door. When we need to protect our space for whatever we're focusing on, we can set a boundary. I once worked with a woman. She was the executive director for an organization I worked for, and every Thursday, I don't know what day it was, but in the afternoon, she put a sign on her door. It said, do not disturb, and there was some kind of ominous icon that she included. And we all knew she is not to be disturbed. The place had to be burning down. And it was a really good lesson to me. She got away with it. And she needed that time to focus on things from her executive position and to not be bothered with petty things during the day. Anyway, environmental boundaries. Okay, having acknowledged what boundaries are and why they're important and the 4 domains in which they can be set, let's look at why it's hard for some of us to set boundaries. The first reason it may be hard is we don't know what we want and need. We're just not clear about it. We've never sat down and thought about it. We've never allowed ourselves to have desires and needs in the first place. So there's no set of reference points for even deciding where a boundary might be needed. Beyond not knowing what we want or need, if we have an insecure attachment style, we may fear that if we set any boundaries in a relationship, we're likely to be seen as undesirable and be abandoned. So we opt for being a people pleaser so that we're ready to accommodate other people's needs at all times and not impose any of our own needs. Related to this is that if we are high in the personality trait of agreeableness, We will be very conflict avoidant. We won't want anything to disrupt the peacefulness of our relationships in case the other person becomes disappointed or angry. That is to be avoided at all costs because it's so unpleasant when somebody else is unhappy. And finally, and these all kind of tie together, they overlap. They're not totally distinct. But another way to look at this is the issue of low self-esteem. It's thinking and feeling that we don't deserve anything, that other people ought to be entitled to what they want, but not us. For some reason, we just don't measure up. We're not good enough to make any demands or to have any needs, and we have to get by on just scraps. We get by on what the universe is willing to toss us, what other people are willing to toss us, because we just don't think enough of ourselves. There can be a deep sense of apology about our very existence, and that somehow we came about through accident and we don't necessarily deserve to be here while other people do. If we're treated poorly, perhaps we deserve it. If other people want things, then we're obligated to provide them. This is putting a fine point on it and exaggerating perhaps where low self-esteem can go, but it can go that far. That can be the underlying tone that some of us spend time living in, and it's quite sad and unnecessary. That's why we need boundaries. Another issue that can come up for people that makes it difficult to set boundaries is a great discomfort with anger. Even a belief that anger is unacceptable, that somehow it's not spiritual, that somehow it inevitably leads to something bad. It's inevitably violent and destructive. So anger is avoided. What's unfortunate about that is that anger is the clue that we have that a boundary has been violated and that a boundary needs to be set. If we cut off that emotion, we don't allow ourselves to feel it, we lose being woken up to the need for it, we lose the energy and the motivation to do something about it. What we do with that anger does turn out to be important. If we overexpress it or we use it like a sledgehammer, yeah, we might create some bad outcomes. But if we harness it and skillfully apply it to setting a necessary boundary, it can be very effective. All right, so drum roll please. How to set boundaries. How to do this. I may disappoint you, but I'll explain it. It's not complicated, really. It comes down to being able to say no. It may be that we have to say what we're saying no about in a very precise way. We may need to explain why we need to say no, but basically we're saying no. You can't do this to me, or you can't take this from me, or you can't give this to me. I'm saying no to it. It also means that we're taking responsibility for that boundary. Hopefully, and in many cases, people will accommodate us. People will recognize a boundary, and a reasonable person is going to grant the boundary. If they don't, then it's on us. What are we going to do next? Not to sit and wait and hope and expect that the other person now must do that thing. If they don't stop, then it's up to us what we're going to do about it. So that's how. Stand firm. Say no. Say what you're saying no about. Stand firm on it and see what happens. Now, the reason I say it's not complicated, it basically comes down to saying no, is that the main work is figuring out why you have a hard time with it in the first place. Figuring out what causes you to hesitate and working on that. If you work on that and overcome low self-esteem and overcome a sense that you don't deserve things and claim your right to exist in this universe and allow that you're going to have needs and desires and conditions that need to be fulfilled for you to exist, if you can do that, if you can really do that, you may need to go into therapy, you may need to journal, I don't know, there are things that you can do, but that's the primary work. Once that's done, saying no just comes along. It's not a trick, it's not some kind of little strategy that you can just tack on. You have to do that underlying work first. And what happens, and I've experienced this and my clients have reported this, when we begin to set boundaries, set limits, we have weird feelings. We can feel uncomfortable. We can feel afraid. We can feel guilty. There's all kinds of stuff that can come up. We do that work to get us to the point of trying it. But then when we do it, it's going to be uncomfortable at first. We have to just keep doing it. And as we do it more, we get more familiar with it. It becomes more natural. We begin to experience the benefits of doing it. And that encourages us even more. We begin to see that not only do our relationships not get worse, they get better. It also can be useful if you're especially hesitant to set boundaries around big things, to start with small things. You know, instead of saying something like, I don't want to have any more kids to your partner who may want kids. That's a big thing. That's a big thing. You might instead say something smaller, like, I'd like to be able to have a cup of coffee in the morning before I talk about anything important. So the point is, experiment with smaller things. Set boundaries around smaller things until you get a little more familiar with it and get a little more comfortable with it, and work yourself up to setting those bigger boundaries. Okay, there are two more important topics within the topic of boundary setting that I want to talk about. So please stick with me for these as well. I think they'll help to round out your understanding of what boundaries are about and how they can operate in your life. First is this, the question, can boundaries be too rigid? Is there a way in which we can become too boundaried? All living things must have boundaries, but they must also have porous boundaries. There must be the possibility of things getting out and things getting in. Otherwise, there's no exchange of energy, information, or material. And those things need to go both ways across that boundary line. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we're embracing the idea of boundaries, so that we don't get so zealous about our boundaries and so maybe ideologically driven that we begin to cut off what we need and we don't release what we need to release because we have a boundary. The boundary is about our separateness, but we're not just separate, we're interdependent, and we're in a symbiotic relationship with the rest of the world. And finding that balance between having the boundaries that allow us to take our particular form while having the openness to be in an exchanging process with the rest of the world is important. So I think making a comment about this is important so that boundaries can be contextualized within this kind of dual system of independent separateness and interdependent symbiotic relationship. The other topic within the topic of boundaries that I want to touch on is that boundaries are not just what we need to set on others to maintain the boundary between us and them. They're things that we need to set on ourselves, that we have self-imposed boundaries or limits that also serve our needs and serve to create the conditions that we need in order to thrive and move forward. Not everything we're going to want to do is going to serve that purpose. We all are going to want to do things regularly that can erode our well-being and our relationships and destroy our environment and cause havoc in our minds, right? Body-mind relationships, environment. We need our own boundaries for ourselves. Sticking to a time to wake up in the morning and a time to go to bed at night might be one of these boundaries. Not going into a bar if you happen to be a recovering alcoholic, maybe another one of these boundaries that would be self-imposed. Not working past 6 p.m. if you tend to be a workaholic and your family needs you. Not eating sugar if you're a diabetic. Not trying to resolve conflicts and arguments with a partner via text messages. Might be a boundary you want to impose for the well-being of yourself and your relationship. Not driving while drunk or sleepy. Not eating food beyond the expiry date. These are just examples, but there are many ways every day, multiple times throughout the day, where we make little choices, and we can decide whether to watch one more YouTube short or something like that, or cut it off. Whether we're going to limit our screen time or not. My point is that throughout the day, we have multiple choices along the way to either set a boundary with ourselves, a limit, or go over it. And it's in relation to our well-being, our immediate well-being and our future goal and our values. Are we in violation of those? Are we eroding the conditions that will support our well-being by doing certain things? Or are we preserving ourselves by deciding not to do those things? Apart from our health and safety, the kinds of things that we might have limits about may have more to do with our values and our character and the kind of person we want to become. There may be things that we need to not do that will take us out of alignment with our values. So we put a limit on ourselves. We decide we're not going to yell at our spouse or our children. We may decide not to dwell on resentments and harboring a grudge for ways that we have felt mistreated. We may decide that we're not going to pretend to go along with the group think about a certain topic because it's safe to do so, because we have a value in telling the truth, standing by our own principles. Years ago in the States, there used to be an advertisement, I believe it was for an investment firm. They had a jingle, and it would be sung, and it was basically this: to know no boundaries. They were putting out this idea that they were representing this idea that there would be no boundaries. And while I understand that this may have been to kind of think outside the box and to allow oneself to have grand ambitions and grand visions, as a basic idea, it always seemed flawed to me from the beginning. I thought, really? No boundaries? No boundaries. And it made me wonder, what kind of business do they run? Do they have no boundaries in the way they run their business? Anyway, boundaries, they're important. To improve your ability to have boundaries in your life, I suggest that you pay close attention to your day-to-day experience and notice where they might be useful. Particularly, see if you can notice, what do you want? What do you need? What is required in order for you to feel safe and engaged with the world and hopeful about your life? What do you need? So begin to notice that. Then on the most simple level, practice saying no. Maybe start with small things and build up. But acknowledge your needs, acknowledge your desires, acknowledge your right to exist, and then the conditions that you need for your life, and then say no when something is crossing the line and intruding on you or taking away what you need. Good luck. May you be the architect of your life and decide what gets in and what gets out. If you've liked this video, please give it a like, subscribe, leave me a comment, share it with a friend, and especially thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope that I've given you some things to think about that make it easier for you to set boundaries if they've been difficult before. Until next time, be well. Bye-bye.